In this video, I will look at the security settings part of group policy and how they can be imported and exported using a security template. If you've been working with computers since Windows XP, you may remember there being a security template that could be applied to Windows XP. This security template changed the local security setting on Windows XP to make it more like Windows 2000. These changes were required in some cases to get old software to run. You could also get other security templates which could be applied to the computer, which would strengthen the security of the computer. Microsoft does not release security templates like these for modern operating systems, as the need for these has been replaced by other tools. One such tool, the Security Configuration Wizard, I will look at in the next video. Regardless of whether you use security templates or not, this video will give you a good understanding of how local security on a computer is configured and can be exported and imported to other computers if required. Every Windows-based computer has a local group policy. This local group policy contains general settings for the computer as well as security settings. When configuring security in your domain, when possible, you want to configure the security using group policy at the domain level. This provides centralized control, making it easier to change later on. In some cases, this may not be possible. For example, you have a computer that is not a member of the domain. When this occurs, you will need to use the local group policy. In some cases, you may want to use local group policy if you only want to apply settings to the one server, or perhaps you want to test a setting on the one server before changing the settings at the domain level. Local group policy settings work the same as they would if they were configured at the domain level, except on domain controllers. This is because when the server is promoted to a domain controller, the local user account database is disabled. For this reason, certain local security settings on a domain controller are ignored. I can open the local group policy editor from the Start menu. The security settings are found under Computer Configuration, Windows Settings, Security Settings. These security settings define local security on the computer. This relates to local resources on the computer like a local user account. For example, if you created a local user account on the computer, you could define settings under security settings like how many days a password can be used on a local account until it needs to be changed, and how complex this password would need to be. If I go back to the Start menu and open Local Security Policy from Administrative Tools under the Start menu, you may think that the security settings found here and in the Local Group Policy look the same. You may think this because the settings are in fact the same settings. When you edit the security settings in Local Security Policy, you are in fact editing the security settings found in the Local Group Policy found here. Local Security Policy gives you a subset of the settings found in the Local Group Policy. In other words, it only shows you the Local Group Policy settings that relate to local security. If I expand into Accounts Policy, you will notice that you can configure some settings relating to password policies for user accounts on the local computer. As we already know from previous videos, when you promote a server to a domain controller, the local user account database on that server is no longer used. What this essentially means is that a domain controller can only use domain accounts, and thus the security settings found in here have no effect on the domain controller. This brings up the question, how would you configure user security settings on a domain controller when a domain controller can only use domain accounts? If I open Group Policy Management from the Start menu, and then select the Domain Controller OU, on the right-hand side you can see that Default Domain Controller Policy. This policy is created by default when the domain is created. You may have wondered why there is a need for this group policy. This group policy is needed to configure security settings on the domain controller, since the local group policy cannot be used to configure the domain accounts that are used on a domain controller. If I edit the group policy and go to the security settings for this group policy, these security settings are used for the domain controllers in the domain rather than the security settings found in the local group policy. By doing this, this improves security for domain controllers. It should be noted that this only applies to security settings. You are free on a domain controller to configure any other local group policy settings outside security settings, and these will be read and applied when group policy is processed on that domain controller. Only security settings are exempt from this process. Once you have your security settings configured, you may want to use these on a different computer. To demonstrate how to do this, I will change to my Windows server that is running on my DMZ. Since this server is running on my DMZ, or perimeter network, I have not made it a member of the domain. Since this server will be accessible from the internet, not having it in the domain will help protect the rest of the network if this server were to be compromised. A lot of time has gone into configuring the security settings on this server. A second DMZ server has been added to the network for fault tolerance, so the same security settings that were applied to this server should be applied to that server. In order to achieve this, I will first open Local Security Policy from Administrative Tools under the Start menu. If I right-click Security Settings at the top, I can export the settings configured on this server to an INF file. I will save this file on a file share so that it can be used later on. Now that the security settings have been saved, I will now change to the backup DMZ server to apply these settings to that server. First of all, I will open the file share that I exported the security settings to and copy this file to the desktop of this server. In order to import the files, I will next open Local Group Policy from the Start menu. To import the settings, all I need to do is right-click on Security Settings and select the option Import Policy. From here, it is a simple matter to browse to the Security Template file and select Open, and it will be imported. The problem with this approach is that you do not know if any changes have already been made on the local computer or exactly what changes will be made. For this reason, I will cancel out of here and look at a different approach to import the settings. The tool that I will use to do this is called Security Configuration and Analysis. This is not available from the Start menu, so instead, I need to run MMC from the Start menu. Once MMC is started, the next step is to select Add Remove Snap-in from the File menu. Once open, I will add Security Configuration and Analysis Snap-in. This tool allows a small database of settings to be created and compared with the current settings on the computer. The settings for this database can be imported from the INF that I created on the first server. To create a database, right-click Security Configuration and Analysis and select the option Open Database. The interface is a little different than what you may normally expect. You could, of course, open an existing database if you had one created previously, which in this case I do not. However, if you do not have a database created and you enter in a database name and select Open, Security Configuration and Analysis will create the database for you. This is a point of confusion when the tool is first used, where an administrator will often look for the new database option, which does not exist. The next dialog box will ask for a security template to import into the new database. In this case, I will select the security template that I saved to the desktop. If you already have an existing database, new templates can be imported and they will merge over the existing settings, overwriting any existing settings when there is a duplicate found. Notice at the bottom there is a tick box. Clear this database before importing. If you want to start fresh with no settings in the database, you can select this box. In this case, since the database is new and does not have any settings in it, it will not make a difference if I tick this box or not. Now that the database has been created and some settings imported into it, the next step is to compare these settings with the settings currently configured on the local computer. To do this, I will right-click on Security Configuration and Analysis and select the option Analyze Computer Now. I will be prompted for a location of the log file, which I will accept the default. I will next expand down into Accounts Policies and then Password Policies. You will notice that all the settings are listed with the current value and the one in the database. For example, if I select Minimum Password Age, that database setting is listed as 0 days, and the current setting or computer setting is also 0 days. If I look at the other settings, you will notice that there are not any differences between the template and the local settings. You can start to see how this tool can be used to tell what effect, if any, applying a security template to your computer may have. When I select Security Options, you will notice that there are settings in here that have been configured. You can see this setting has been enabled in the database and disabled in the local setting on this computer. If I open the properties for this setting, I can see the title at the top that will give me an indication of what the setting does. But just like if I configured it using Group Policy, I can select the Explain tab to get a lot more information about what the setting does. If I go back to the settings, notice that there are other settings that have been configured that are different from the local settings. If I open this setting will display a message before the user logs into the computer. Notice that I can disable this setting if I wish. When I go back, notice the setting has changed to Not Analyzed. This is fine. This is basically saying that no setting exists. You can see that you can use one server as a baseline for another server. Before you apply the settings, you can make any changes you want. When you are ready to apply the setting, right-click Security Configuration and Analysis and select the option Configure Computer Now. Once again, I will be asked where to store the log file, which I will accept the default location. Security Configuration and Analysis can also be run from the command line. If I open a command prompt, the first parameter I will look at is Validate. Validate checks a security template for errors. To run this command, all you need to do is add the file name and it will tell you if it found any problems with the file. The next parameter I will look at is Import. This will import a security template into the database. To use this, you need to add the DB parameter and the CFG parameter. These parameters indicate where the database is located and also where the file for the security template is located. If you want to start again with an empty database, add the Overwrite parameter. This will ensure the database is empty before the import. Otherwise, the data will be merged with the existing data, replacing any existing data when there is a duplication. If you want to perform an analysis of the data in the database against what is configured on the local computer, you can do this with the Analyze parameter. All you need to add is the DB parameter to indicate where the database is located. If you want to review the results, you will need to use the graphical version of Security Configuration and Analysis. If you want to apply the settings stored in the database to the local computer, this can be done with the Configure parameter. Like the Analyze parameter, all you need to add is the DB parameter to indicate where the database is. There have been a lot of points covered in this video, so I will do a quick summary of the major points. Every Windows computer has a local group policy. Inside this group policy is a number of settings that configure how local security on the computer works. These allow you to configure settings like when passwords will expire for user accounts created on that computer. The settings all define rights that users will have. For example, you could configure all users to have the right to backup files if you so desired. Since a domain controller has the local user's account disabled and can only use domain user accounts for additional security, the security settings found in the local group policy on a domain controller do not have any effect, since no local user accounts are in use. For this reason, an additional group policy called Default Domain Controller Policy is created when the domain is created to ensure that domain controllers have security settings applied that will work with domain accounts. Once you have the security settings part of group policy configured the way you want, this can be exported to an INF file and imported into a domain or local group policy. Microsoft also supplies a security configuration and analysis tool to compare the settings in the INF with what is configured locally. In the next video, I will look at the Security Configuration Wizard. This tool allows the administrator to configure additional security options like firewall rules and security for services. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.